Professor Ian Owens, Executive Director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, is an ornithologist interested in ecology, evolution, and the conservation of birds, and using the power of birds to engage the public with big questions in science and global sustainability. The central question of his research is, what are the ecological and evolutionary mechanisms that drive biological diversification? He tackles this question at both the macro and microevolutionary scales using a combination of field experiments plus phylogenetic, and spatial analyses, combining all of his work based on birds because of the unrivaled depth of information in the ecology, behavior, systematics, and geographical distribution of bird species, as well as the ability to manipulate genetic pedigrees, observe behavior, and monitor individual reproduction and mortality in free-living bird populations. So please join me now in a warm welcome for tonight's speaker, Professor Ian Owens.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. This is the sort of group into which I was welcomed into the bird watching world. So I feel very much at home here. And although I haven't met as many of you as I would expect by now, I've been here about 18 months. Those of you I have met have been incredibly welcoming to me. So thank you for that. I feel very much at home in a club like this. So today I'm going to talk about some personal reflections I have on how technology is influencing bird watching and citizen science. I think it's happening at an incredibly rapid rate now. And I'll be honest with you, much of what I'm going to talk about excites me a lot. I think that bird watching, bird watchers, and citizen science are going to have an even bigger impact in the years ahead. And some of it slightly terrifies me as well. Because, you know, I look around the room and I suspect, like me, you've been around long enough that the only tool you used to have, 30, 40 years ago was a pair of binoculars, maybe not even a telescope, but a pair of binoculars and a field guide. Now that has changed a lot. And sometimes it feels like, we spend a lot of time looking at our phones now rather than at the birds or at the field guide. But I'm going to try and have a conversation about what's good about that and what we need to be careful with that. So let's have a look. Let me start. Let's start by remembering why we've had such an enormous influence on the world around us as bird watchers. Sorry? It's important to remember, I think it's easy to forget as bird watchers, what an incredible role we have played on the understanding of biodiversity, on the world around us, and how that is changing, and how it has changed over the last few decades. There is way more known about birds. There are way more of you, expert bird watchers out there, than there is for any other group. In some ways, I often say when I'm talking to broader groups, I say, I wish that weren't the case. I wish there were as many people that knew about beetles and slime molds and so on as there are about birds. But that's not the case. Right now, we have accumulated a huge amount of information about birds. And we have traditionally put that to use. So the two graphs you can see here, the one on the left will be famous to you. That's the 3 billion birds paper led from people around here and across the rest of the country. That is largely based on expert observers of birds going out there on things like the Christmas bird count and so on, and figuring out how many birds there were and how that's changed over time. You can see that the consequences of that have been horrific, really, to look at. The loss of, I would say, the loss of about 20 to 30% of individual birds across North America in the last 30 years, since 1970. I see that as kind of a silent ecological collapse, because this isn't just rare birds. This is also common birds, as we'll see in a moment. So they're really disappearing. The one on the right there is the equivalent graph from the UK, which is obviously, you can hear from my strong Brooklyn accent, that's where I come from. I won't try and do an American accent, it's not good enough yet. One day I'll come back and try it. The one on the right there is showing that it isn't restricted to North America. In other parts of the world where there are a lot of fanatical bird watchers and you can get this sort of data, you get almost exactly the same pattern. Bird populations typically typically declining by about 0.5% and 2% every year. Now that doesn't sound too much, does it? 0.5% or 2% per year. But you think of how that builds up, even during our lifetimes, that's how you can lose 30% of the entire avifauna during our lives. And that's what's happening at the moment, almost identical in Europe to which it is in North America. This is the traditional pattern. I would say that this is the best data showing us what's happening to these major ecosystems. The trouble with this type of data is it's relatively difficult to action. We typically do, a count each year or a count every few years, and therefore it's difficult for us to figure out, it's this woodland here that's declining this week. Because we're using expert bird watchers, you can only come back and do it so often. So we can watch the decline go on, we can track that decline in ever more detail. It's hard for us to though say, how do we manage our way out of this? What can we do to make a difference? Or if we establish a new reserve or something like that, it's hard for us to use just the expert citizen scientists to be able to figure out what's working on these reserves or not. And that's where schemes like eBird have been so successful. Now, we should remember that when eBird was invented and really pushed forward, and I think Steve is coming to talk to this group in a few weeks' time, isn't he? So I'm sure you'll hear from Steve about it. eBird is really a radically different approach to ornithology. To all of you, I suspect that know it pretty well. It's become an everyday part of how we do bird watching. 20 years ago, it was considered borderline sacrilege that you could have everyday members of the population, if you like, submitting bird records in an unstructured way or a semi-structured way. Because remember, the traditional way that we've always done it is expert advisors, expert observers go out, do the same sort of observation each year in a very controlled way, like the Christmas bird count that you're going to do in a couple of weeks' time. eBird isn't like that. Different people observing birds often in different ways for different periods of time and so on. That's why it's called semi-structured. It's not completely random because we'll see in a moment people submit full lists and so on, but it's really, really messy data compared to that tight data that you get from things like the Christmas bird count. So this has been revolutionary. On this graph, you can see some of the consequences of that. The big map in the middle there, the black and gold map, it looks a little bit like the maps of the Earth from space when you can look at all those lights. They're not lights, those are eBird lists that you can see on there. So now there's approaching 1.3 billion observations through eBird. It is by far the biggest database on biodiversity on the planet, and it has been developed by citizen scientists around the world. You can see that they're not evenly distributed around the world, big concentrations in North America and Europe, and growing concentrations in Australia and the Indian subcontinent. But look at all those observations, look at all those bird watchers and what they're doing. This is also a technological development. This would not have been possible without things like apps and the links that come from those apps. So this is really ornithologists starting to adopt things like that and apply it at a global scale. The little map on the right there is the UN's webpage for biodiversity information called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information System. You can see on red where most of the data is, in yellow there's less data and so on. Half of the data in the United Nations Index for biodiversity comes from eBird, comes from amateur, enthusiast bird watchers. You make a phenomenal contribution to what we know about the planet and what organizations like the UN are using to figure out how to overcome the biodiversity crisis. That's what allows, and you'll have seen this a few times, I suspect, from that. That's what's allowed us to do these sorts of models. Global models of occurrence, abundance, and change, and movement. You can see on the right there, that list shows you why I call these semi-structured models. In fact, to create these sorts of models here of how a barn swallow is moving through the year, you actually need to get a few things right about these models. So they're almost always based on complete lists. When you're doing eBird and it says, is this a complete list of all the birds that you've seen? That's one of the most important buttons that you press. I'm sure this has been drilled into you over the years many times. By pressing that button, that makes this data so much more analyzable. But you can see the other things that are used as here. Typically, we're using statistics after that to control for things like which species it is, what time of day it is, what time of year it is, and habitat, and so on. So there's actually a lot of very fancy statistics that go into extracting information from messy data. And that's often the trade-off that you find as a scientist. If you do a great experiment or very controlled observations like the Christmas bird count, you have cleaner data and you don't have to do such fancy statistics. With things like eBird, that is very messy data. We need to apply gradually more and more complicated statistics or more sophisticated statistics to it to figure out where the signal in there, where the truth is in amongst all those other things. But now we're able to do this at a really grand scale. Gradually, we're ramping up our kind of statistical capabilities to match those 1.3 billion observations that people have made. And the data we can now cut at a very fine scale. Remember previously I said that for a lot of the traditional approaches, you basically get one slice through the data a year, and often it can be on a large scale. It can be a county level, a state level, or even larger than that. With these approaches, using eBird data with very advanced statistics, we're now able to do these sorts of maps down to 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer geographical scale, and each week of the year. So we don't just know where mountain plovers are kind of in general, we know where all the mountain plovers are on a 3 by 3K grid for each week of the year. Now that is a massive advance. Of course, for us it's fun because it means, okay, if I want to go and see mountain plovers, I know where to go and find them. The difference though, if you're managing a reserve or figuring out where you might want to buy for a new protected area, that makes a huge difference because it makes you know that either this is the key area to pick the key woodland or the key sierra or whatever it might be, or if you're protecting a flyway or an estuary or something like that, it tells you exactly when to do that protection. So what we found is that no longer are we just seen as kind of the doom mongers that come along and say the birds are dying, you have to do something about it. And governments and corporations say, well, what do we do? And we can't say much. With this sort of data, more and more we're able to say, this is what you need to do. These are the protected species. This is exactly where they live. This is where they move through. And these are the sorts of actions that you need to take. So that's why I talk about actionable data. This huge amounts of messy data boiled down with statistics to create very highly detailed maps. This happens to be for shorebirds. And then on the right there, you can see, working with a group of agencies, identify 41 sites throughout the Americas that are key for these groups of birds. When we provide this type of information as a community, I have typically found organizations very ready to listen and to try to help with it if we can provide solutions and often show what's worked elsewhere in the world or at other times. We've also found that new industries, such as the renewable energy industry, is interested in this sort of data. You've all heard how much people are trying to get into green energy and so on. You all know that if you put these big turbines in the wrong place and turn them on at the wrong time, they can be dangerous. Well, these new very high resolution maps from eBird of where these sorts of particularly where big birds like eagles and so on are flying, are now being used by the industry to try and figure out where are relatively safe places to put these turbine installations. So on the top left there, you can see a map, one of these fine scale maps showing where eagle populations are across North America. Bottom left there, this is us trying to figure out where the relatively low collision sites might be. And on the right there is a map of West Virginia, where the state agencies who are wanting to give permission for wind turbines to be installed, in part because they think they need to switch the types of industries that there are in West Virginia, are coming to groups like ourselves to say, where are the places we mustn't put these turbines? And that turns out to be the green areas. Those would be the most dangerous areas with respect to collisions with eagles. And therefore, the paler areas are the areas where, if you're going to put up wind turbines in West Virginia, these are probably the areas to put it. And you can see that's timely information, because on that map, the green shows you where there are most eagle sightings. The circles show you where there are eagle eyries. And those red lines are where there are currently wind turbines, which were, of course, done before this information was available. And you can see at the moment, many of the turbines that have been put in so far have not been put in the smartest places with respect to those eagles. So I see it as our task to figure out those aren't good places to do it. When you invest in this industry at a larger scale, you use this information and try and site these wind turbines at places where there is far less risk of collision. My hope is we'll also be able to give them extra advice than that. We'll also be able to tell them when these birds are most active and at times of the year when we've got migrant birds flying through, to try and tell them when to do the maintenance of these turbines, so that the turbines, they need to be off for a brief period of the year. So make sure they're off at the most dangerous times of the year. But if you think about it, this is all from that quite fancy eBird data, all coming through the system, people like yourselves collecting it being processed, and then being able to provide this advice straight into the state agencies. So they are now coming to us to asking for this sort of information. I wouldn't represent this as a panacea, that this means that there's no danger from these types of technologies. But I guess my perspective is that I think that these sorts of turbines will be put out there. One of our jobs, therefore, is to try to make sure it's done in the smartest possible way with respect to nature. Here's another example of a similar sort of thing. These are some maps from Costa Rica, again, based on eBird observations. The one on the left shows conservation relevant bird species. That's typically either rare species or declining species. The one in the middle shows a series of coffee plantations and grades each of those coffee plantations with respect to how well it's doing for the species you might expect to be there. Then on the right, we have a thing called this is the Biodiversity Progress Index. This is trying for each different finca, for each different coffee farm, saying how well they're doing at the moment, how well they're doing compared to the type of farm it is, and how well they could be doing if they invested in different sorts of habitat restoration and so on. So again, the secret in almost all of these cases, whether it's coffee growers, or whether it's people wanting to regulate renewable energy and so on, if we just come to them saying that, there's a decline in birds, please don't do anything, we basically can't get in the door. What they're typically wanting from us is say, what's the best way to run a coffee plantation for birds? We try to give them advice on that, and then we help them to monitor it to figure out whether it's working or not. When we do that, we sometimes find that in the case of Costa Rica, an entire country starts to come to us to ask for eBird and ask for biodiversity information. What is that biodiversity information? Well, right now, because of groups like yourself, it's eBird data, because that's the only thing that's at that scale where you can get down to an individual farm, and we can often do it week by week, which birds are there. And we can say that even after a few months, when they do the investment in new types of planting, we can say, it's working. Your biodiversity index is growing up. You're doing well, you're influencing your neighbors, and so on. And that's what we find we need to be able to make that virtuous circle work. The really hard part of this, though, has been to try to extract not just information about where the birds are and how they're moving, but to try and get quantitative information on how bird populations are changing over time. And again, to be able to do that at a very, very, very fine scale. Well, now we can do that. We have just developed methods to be able to apply, the sort of machine learning you hear about people using to identify, driving Tesla cars and so on, all that pattern recognition type stuff. We're using some similar sorts of technology, not just to analyze eBird occurrence data, but also changes in eBird data across time. That's really hard stuff to do. Briefly, what we do is there's too much data. If you imagine you've got the eBird data, even for North America, which we're going to look at in a moment. For North America, if you get all of the eBird observations and you do that across 20 or 30 years, it is a vast amount of very messy data. More data than any computer can handle in a straightforward way at the moment, which I guess we should be proud of, that we are now creating data at the sort of scale that people normally get from looking at the stars. So we're at that kind of big data level. So what we do, and this isn't me, this is the kind of the clever statisticians and mathematicians that work here. What they do with that is, you see on the left there, that kind of set of boxes looks like a modern art sort of thing. What that is a whole, that's the map of North America with a whole series of boxes drawn on it. And we do a separate model for each of those boxes. The boxes are slightly smaller and slightly more simplified. So we can run a model for each of those boxes. And then we bring all of those together to create an overall map for North America. It's a phenomenal computational task. But by doing that, we can start to detect increases and decreases in populations, not just across all of the US or even across kind of the East, the West, and the Midwest. We can do it for areas of about 8 miles radius. So we're talking about the Cayuga basin and smaller within that basin. So we can look at, if you like, the bobolinks within the basin that we're so interested in. Now that one I'll show you on the right there is wood thrush. The scale for these, so this is for obviously for the Eastern US. The way to read these maps is each dot is showing you a population, an 8 mile radius circle, where we have enough data to say whether in that dot the population has gone up or it's gone down. If it's a blue dot, the population has gone up in the last 20 or 30 years. And if it's a red dot, it's gone down. If it's a big blue dot, it's gone up a lot. And if it's a big red dot, it's gone down a lot. So you can see this is quite a common pattern. We've been surprised by how many species like the wood thrush have geographical variation in where the populations have gone up and down. You can see that in the wood thrushes, in the northeast, they've tended to decline, where in the center of the range, they've increased. Quite a lot of populations do this. Now, all these maps have just gone live on the eBird site. They're called the eBird trend maps. Miyoko's at the back there, about 550 or so maps have just gone live for North American birds. So again, I should emphasize that this is by far the biggest, most sophisticated analysis of citizen science data that anybody has ever attempted. And again, I can't overemphasize it. It is totally based on bird watchers in the field producing data at this scale. Now, I'm going to show you a few of these maps, and I warn you ahead of time. When I first looked at it, and I remember when Miyoko and the rest of the team shared the links with me, I couldn't wait to look at these maps. It's like Christmas. Like, my goodness, you know, they finally managed to put together all this data and show the maps and so on. Half an hour later, I felt differently. Let me show you some of these maps. You can probably guess what's coming, can't you? And the thing is, I'm not going to show you the species that we know are already on the brink of extinction. They're really highly endangered species. I'm hoping to show you here species that you have a relationship, even that I have a relationship, having only been here a year and a half. So, you know, the wonderful cerulean warbler. Many of us, you know, spend our summers chasing, declining across almost all of its range. Even species like chimney swift. This is a hard species to survey using traditional methods because you don't necessarily see them enough. Things like eBird allow you to record a lot of swifts. Look at the extent of decline there. What due to? Probably a mixture, I would guess, of loss of breeding sites and a massive collapse in insect numbers. I would guess, but we don't yet know this. Nobody's ever had 500 maps of species from an area to analyze in the depth that we'll now analyze these. One of our favorites, of course, bobolink. So when I went through these for the first half hour, it was really jaw-dropping to look through each of these different groups. And if you look at it, you will see hundreds of species that are swathes of red. Not all. Now, we'll come on in a moment to look at a couple of others. Not all. There are some glimmers of hope in this. You see things like bald eagle, for example, having gone very low and now coming back. So there are glimmers of hope in there. But what I was shocked by was how many species that I knew well, that I go out and have in the case of bobolinks, we're all lucky, aren't we? We get to see these things. When you do the calculations, you realize that bobolinks have indeed lost about half their population in the last 30 years. And you know what? When we run these models forward, we calculate they'll lose another half in the same period coming up. So these creatures really are in collapse. Now, I realize that's a very grim kind of thing. It's not much of an entertaining evening, if you like, to show that and to show this is what the data show. I guess what I'm interested in doing is demonstrating by putting together this army of natural historians and these fancy technologies and so on, we are getting better and better data. I think that the message for us is we need to figure out now how to use this to reverse these declines. We have wonderful data. You cannot miss the message. We have to get out there and convince people to reverse these declines because they're incredibly extensive across both space and species. If you combine them, say this is, if you pick the grassland specialist species, so the bobolinks and many of the sparrows and so on, and draw the map for those, this would be the map for grasslands. This is for about 20 or 30 grassland species, I think. You can see the grasslands literally on fire through the center of the country there. Now, so if you look onto, we could circulate this if you wanted to in the newsletters and so on. If you go and look for eBird trend maps, I wouldn't say that you'll come away with it a big smile. I hope you'll come away with it thinking, we need to do something about this. We've collected this data. We now need to make a difference with this data. We've also compiled this data with a whole series of other organizations, about 20 other organizations, into this booklet called the State of the Birds 2022 for the US. This goes through each of the major groups of birds and looks at these trajectories of whether they're increasing and decreasing. Not surprisingly, you can see that most of those lines between 1970 and 2020, many of them are going down, and you can see the different groups. The bottom line there, what we call tipping point species, are species like the bobolink that have lost half their population and look like they're going to lose the other half rather rapidly. So we've tried to pull those out. Again, not the ultra endangered species. They're not condors and things like this. They are things that I think that you have grown up with, and I have come to love since coming here. And now I think we really are facing the prospect of we won't hand these species on to our grandchildren if we don't arrest these declines. They are so severe. You can see in here, there are a few groups which are increasing. You see at the top the water birds and the diving ducks and the dabbling ducks. As I said before, we haven't done all the analysis to really understand the biology behind this, but we think that's due to a couple of factors. Now, one, like the bald eagle, is probably because some of those populations were heavily depressed, and therefore they're growing out of some of that. But in the case of these water birds, and particularly the ducks and wildfowl, what we can see so far suggests that they have actually been looked after not just by bird watching communities, but also by hunting communities. And they have invested in land, and although they have shot those populations, they have also protected those populations and probably more importantly, the land. And that has had a noticeable effect across this period. To me, that's an example of probably the type of work that we need to do. We need to be able to build those broad partnerships. So in the same way as the hunters have effectively helped those wildfowl populations, we need to find the ranchers that can do the same thing for those grasslands. It needs to be that broad cross-political alliance to bring these birds back, because you can't do it just as bird watchers alone. So that's one revolution. We're going to bring these things together at the end. We now have more data and more fancy statistical techniques than any comparable group of natural historians out there. We really have reached, if you like, the rocket science of how to do large-scale ecology, particularly in areas like North America, Europe, India, Australia, where there are people organizing in this sort of way. But I think we're all also aware that there's a second revolution coming, if you like, and that's the bioacoustic revolution. Now, with the combination of artificial intelligence methods for identifying birdsong, plus the fact we can put those artificial intelligence algorithms onto a phone, an iPhone or an Android phone, and the fact we can make little devices and strap them onto trees, passive acoustic monitors, we are no longer the only tool for detecting birds. These types of devices that we're putting out there, they're not necessarily, well, they're not as good as an expert observer. But by putting hundreds or even thousands of them, as you'll see in a moment, across landscapes, we're now being able to monitor landscapes 24/7 for those birds that call regularly. Now, probably the most familiar example of this to everybody here will be Sound ID on Merlin. How many of you use Merlin Sound ID at the moment? Okay, a fair chunk of you. It's been called the Holy Grail of bird identification. Kind of catchy, but actually the one I like best, the description I like best of it was someone wrote, it's the biggest leap forward in field bird watching since the field guide. I don't know about you, but I remember being interested in bird. It was actually my father that gave me the equivalent of the Peterson Guide to Europe, and opening that and thinking, wow, this is my way in to this information. Those birds that I haven't been able to figure out, now I start to understand them. We get a lot of similar reports for Merlin. It opens up the world of bird calls and the world of bird songs for people that either hadn't found that approachable before, or some people who haven't got such good hearing, or some people who have lost some of their hearing. They're suddenly being able to detect these birds before. But now it's going away from just a kind of tool, a fun tool that we have on our phones. It's now becoming a tool that we can really go out there and accurately survey populations of birds. There are caveats on it, like there are when you walk through a woodland, you don't see all birds. You need to use a kind of bit of statistics to compare what you've seen with what's probably in that wood. So bioacoustics isn't perfect, and it doesn't detect all birds, but it does detect some birds that we couldn't detect easily by sight. And some birds which only the very best observers, the most experienced observers could get before. So this is really changing how people are bird watching. Particularly, this is now available in North and some parts of Central America, and across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and so on. So some big bird watching populations now have some very fancy tools in their pocket. As you can see, this graph here shows you the uptake of Merlin through the year. We usually get this kind of seasonal increase during the spring and so on. So far, about 10 million people have downloaded Merlin. And I think on our peak days in May, we were giving identifications on, wait for it, and this was just in North America, 140 million identifications a day on some of these birds. So we are serving lots and lots and lots of data. We still need to go further, though. There are still some things for Merlin which are still tricky. And here are some examples of this. I'm guessing that you've all seen these things called sonograms or sonographs. So yeah, along the horizontal line, you've got time. On the vertical line, you've got frequency. So you can see there the little chirping vireo call of a red-eyed vireo. These are the three problems we typically have. Either we have species that just sound rather similar. Now, an experienced observer can often tease them apart. The computer can sometimes be fooled by that. So we still spend a lot of time trying to tease apart those hard pairs of species. Some species, this is really irritating, purposefully mimic each other. And, you know, the bane of our life are mockingbirds. We still can't, mockingbirds are way smarter than we are. So there are some birds that are really, really difficult for us to figure out, is this the real McCoy or is this somebody mimicking them? They're good at doing that. And then the other one, which is quite common, is what you can see at the bottom here, when everybody speaks at the same time. Now, gradually, we are getting better at figuring these things out. But here, lots of people ask me, well, how accurate is Merlin? And how accurate can you make Merlin? Well, this is a complicated graph, but we should understand where we are with this. Let me speak through it first. So, how accurate is Merlin? Well, when you think about it, when you kind of hold your phone up in a woodland, turn Sound ID and so on, there's two things that would be easy or relatively easy. One is to try to give an ID for every sound that is heard, is to try to give an ID for all of them, make a guess, and not worry about getting it wrong. So it's really easy to give lots of guesses and have low accuracy. Well, that doesn't work, does it? Because you just be like, well, this is a waste of time. I think that's what people were fearful of when we first brought these sorts of things out. The other thing that's really easy, which we did at the beginning, or we did more of at the beginning, was not to give many suggestions, but to make sure they're right. So to make sure you've got a really nice recording of the song, you're really sure it's different from anything else, and then say, okay, that is a common yellowthroat, because you're pretty sure of it. You just recorded 5 minutes on your phone. Now, that ain't much good either, because people want to, they're hearing them calling. They're like, tell me now what it is. So the trick is to be able to almost always give a suggestion and almost always get that suggestion right. And that's the trade-off we're continually trying to make. So this graph shows you where we are with the North American birds at the moment. The vertical axis, and each of those dots is a North American bird species. So the vertical axis there shows you average precision. So a high number means that for average, or a 1, means that on average, we get it right every single time when we test it against the kind of known set of sounds. On the horizontal axis there, that means the miss rate. That means if it's 0, we never miss the call. We always get it dead right. If it went up to 1, it means we almost always miss it. So we're wanting to force everything into the top left-hand corner. 0 miss rate, we always get them. We always make a prediction. And 1, we always get it right. And you can see, this is our data from not very long ago. You can see that we've got a fair bunch of species in that top left-hand corner. But there's a trail of species going down to the right. And those are those tricky ones. And you can imagine who that bloody red dot is right down the bottom there. That's, of course, mockingbirds, which just so if you ever hear a mockingbird calling and you turn on Merlin and go, why won't this thing tell me? The computer is going, I know it's a mockingbird, and I'm not going to say anything until I know more. So that's what we're playing in at the moment. But what we're doing at the moment, we've got about 2,000 people who are working on this intensively, kind of as a community. And what we do each week is they tell us what problems they're having. We play around with all the kind of boxes around the calls. We reload the things each weekend, and then we send new models out. So we're continually trying to drive these points up to the top left-hand corner. When we first launched this, most of these points were kind of in the middle. And if you look at the European graph that would be equivalent to this, most of those would be in the middle at the moment, because we need that sort of citizen science, that feedback for what's working and what's not, to drive things in that left-hand corner. But I guess the cool thing is that by doing that, by having a massive bank of recordings to work with, a group of people that are dedicated to saying what's working as well, we can drive these kind of algorithms, as people call them, machine learning algorithms, to be incredibly accurate. And that's what we're working on at the moment, trying to do that. It's important to remember that this isn't just to make our iPhones better. This is also that so we can make devices that we can put out into areas where you can't have citizen scientists all the time. This is a nice example. So on the right there, that map there is of the Sierra Nevada. I'm in California. You can just see where San Francisco is. And the mountains behind there, Yosemite and so on. Each one of those blue dots there is a little Swift recorder. So for those of you that are old enough to remember cigarettes and so on, it's about 2 packets of cigarettes next to each other, bolted to a tree. In there, there's some batteries, there's a microphone, and there's a little computer that is 24/7 listening to what's going on in the Sierra Nevada. So that's like having 2,000 very good recorders across those mountains year in, year out, all day, every day. We need to go back every month to take the memory, at the moment, to take the memory card out of them and to put new batteries in there. But when we bring that data back, we get a really good record. Now, this system was actually created to monitor spotted owls and barred owls, but now it's also being used for, I think, about 100 bird species, and we're starting to also use it to record mammals and amphibians and even insects and so on. So again, I emphasize, this ain't perfect. This isn't like you all being there, 24/7. But boy, it's getting close. We're getting so much data now. Like with the eBird thing, it's messy data, but if we can handle it right, we're extracting a lot of information from this. And it is allowing these conservation teams to figure out exactly where these southern spotted owls are and try and protect them live. What next? Well, as I said, one of the limitations with these little cigarette boxes attached to trees at the moment is that we need to go back every month to change the memory card, just like in a phone, and to change the batteries. But as you'd expect, we're working on this as well. So we're now developing, one of the reasons for that is at the moment we record all the sounds they hear each 24/7. So it's a massive amount of data that we have to bring home. What we're doing now is inside those little cigarette packets, we're putting a real little computer, a Raspberry Pi, as people call them, and putting a little card in there that can actually do all of these fancy algorithms inside the device. So we no longer have to bring home the entire soundscape. We just bring home, I heard 3 spotted owls. As soon as you do that, that also makes it possible. We don't have to go out there anymore to bring that card home. That's a sufficiently small package of data that we can send that through a cell phone or through a satellite link. So what we're trying to create now with devices that we could deploy anywhere on the planet using solar power and probably something like a Starlink communication system. So you can be sending this information out of the most remote forests. We haven't yet figured out how to model that data as well as we can do it for eBird, but that's the challenge now. And my guess is that that's going to be the way that we fill some of those holes on that eBird map. In some of those countries, there probably are communities that will turn to bird watching and do citizen science, but sometimes the population densities are just too low. My guess is it's going to be these sorts of devices deployed on a vast scale. So far, 2,000 is the biggest number we've put out. My guess is we're talking about putting tens of thousands of these things out in some of these forests and bringing the data back remotely. It's also not just the calls that birds make, when they're singing or calling in the bush. How many people here have heard migratory flight calls going over? This is a great place to hear that. Okay, I'm just coming into the country. I find them almost impenetrable, what those sounds are. But a lot of you will be able to identify individual species. Now, we've known for a long time from things like the celebration of light that we can hear these calls, that we can pick them out on sonographs and so on, that different species reliably give different calls, albeit different from their normal call. Well, now, you can probably guess this. We've been training Merlin not just to recognize normal songs and normal calls, but training Merlin to also recognize flight calls. And this is some preliminary kind of very fresh data looking at that. So what each of these two graphs shows that here is when we've got banks of these little swift recorders out, the birds are flying over, we record everything, and then we get a highly skilled human to say how many times they've heard an ovenbird or a grey-cheeked thrush or whatever it is. And then we get the algorithm, we get Merlin to do the same. And you can see these graphs aren't perfect alignment, but you can see we're starting to get some alignment between what Merlin hears in the field and what the very best observers hear in the field. These dots are not yet in the top left-hand corner. So what we're trying to do now is get those dots pushed up there so that we can put banks of recorders across the lakes and the sorts of places we're looking at before with the motor recorders to figure out which species are going over. Hopefully you've all seen these sorts of maps. This is the birdcast map done with radar. These have had an enormous effect on people turning out lights and things like that in Texas and Chicago, New York City and so on. But at the moment, sometimes, I can't remember how many there are on this one, going over this night. Well, let's have a look. Okay, nearly 3/4. That's in millions. That's nearly 3/4 of a billion birds going over some of these nights. Massive. You know, it's one of the great wildlife spectacles going over our heads. What we're trying to do now is trying to figure out which species are flying over on which nights. Now, it won't be as precise as eBird observations and so on, but what we're starting to find is that some of the great flights of particularly the boreal forest warblers is they will come over in just a few nights of the year. So if you like, entire populations of warblers are flying over, say, Connecticut and New York 3-4 nights of the year. So you understand if they hit a stormy night and they end up in New York and they're hitting the windows and everything, that's why it has such a devastating effect on them. So we're trying to figure out which birds are flying on which species are flying on which nights and what we can do to help them, what dangers they face in doing that. Again, using Merlin recorders to try and figure out who is out there. Okay, so you can probably tell that's why I think as bird watchers, we've kind of gone from using our binoculars and our field guides to using eBird, to using Merlin, to now using these Swift recorders and so on. I don't suppose many of us think about ourselves as kind of technological revolutionaries, but we effectively are, the way we're collecting this data now and the scale at which we're doing it. Now, I guess the other thing that I often think about is this is working, you know, this is happening at a grand scale in North America and Europe. What about the rest of the world? Well, I don't know whether any of you have ever looked up this scheme, Bird Count India, but this is one of the schemes that always gives me most hope. Because, you know, we all know that a lot of the diversity that we really want to protect on a global scale is in that, it's in the global south. It's in those countries where we often go and visit, but haven't got such high densities of bird watchers. This group of people, Bird Count India, use eBird to do subcontinent-wide monitoring of bird populations, organizing groups, surveying that enormous and complicated country, doing the analysis and producing the reports at the end of the year that are now the biggest reports on Indian subcontinent biodiversity. So that's being picked up by communities. So they use eBird, but they use eBird in a very, very progressive way. They are always telling us how better to build eBird to be able to drive surveying at this scale. And when you look at who's often involved in these groups, it's often youth groups, if you like, that are driving these sorts of projects. Really inspiring to look at. We're finding the same thing with Merlin. Lots of communities in South America in particular have seen how Merlin works in North America. They want to do it for those communities. So they are now out, they're saying to us, which birds do we need to record to be able to train an algorithm? They're out there recording those birds to create Merlin so that they can then survey the forests that matter to them. Really inspirational stuff. And, you know, the lab, and I'm very proud to be part of the lab that is helping that, but it really is helping. It's these communities that are driving it. They've seen the tools they want to build and they are building them. In some cases, we do get involved in a more direct way. So I love this set of photographs as well. Three great sets of forests: South American, Central and West Africa, and then Southeast Asia. Those are the great forests where the diversity remains and where the final battles will be won or lost in those forests. So we are very keen to be able to get people empowered to be able to do surveys in Southeast Asian forests and so on. So these are a group of people who have entered our Southeast Asia mentorship scheme. And what they do, they sign up for that. They describe a project where they want to use bioacoustic monitoring in forests. So they're doing the very hardest stuff. And then we send the equipment to them, we send trainers to them, and then they do those projects. And I love looking at these pictures here. We ask them to take photographs on the day when the recorders arrive. They take photographs, and then later they kind of show us what they've been doing with them. I mean, we have been struck again and again that, you know, it helps to provide some of this mentoring at the beginning, but after that, the projects take off in ways that we would never have dreamt. And now there's about 24 sites going from Malaysia through to Papua New Guinea, where these types of teams are surveying a vast array of birds, amphibians, and mammals. Really inspirational stuff using absolutely cutting edge approaches. So last couple of slides, I guess the things I often want us to think about, what does this mean for bird watching and citizen science? I guess when I look at, depending on which mood I'm in, sometimes I wander around Sapsucker Woods and so on, and I see a lot of undergraduates looking at their phones, and I think, just put Merlin away for a moment and listen to that warbler. You know what this is. You can look. So I appreciate that some of these technologies can get between you as an individual and the nature that you're trying to look at. But I do think the prospect now for surveying at a very large scale, providing conservation, detailed conservation information to corporations and to agencies, and helping groups around the world do that for their countries and for their forests. It's a really unprecedented moment for doing that. And as you can see from those birds' populations declining, we haven't got 50 years to play with this. We need to make a difference in the next 10 years or so to do this. So I'm excited by this combination, mostly. This combination of observations through things like eBird, through the bioacoustic monitoring, and then the remote sensing. But I think it will feel different to us as ornithologists when all of this starts to happen. It's going to feel, my goodness, what happened to that? What happened to the simple pleasures of bird watching? I think the other thing that we're going to find is that we are already thinking about how to better design these apps. The lab has created kind of 2 apps that are very, broadly used, and I know particularly around here with eBird and Merlin. Already though now, when I kind of go around and talk to people, particularly if I've got a hat with a sapsucker on it, I am guaranteed that both Sally and I will get a whole series of people usually saying, are you those guys that make the app? Like, you say, do you like the app? Yeah, you do. Okay, yes, definitely. We're the guys that make the app. Otherwise it's Audubon. But yes, we say it. It's us. Immediately then there'll be a whole series of requests. These are the things that need to come next. And that list on the right there are the sorts of things that people are continually asking for. The first one is obvious. People don't like flipping between the apps all the time. They want eBird to have at least sound ID in it so that they can make a decision about, yeah, I'm going to include that bird or not. That changes the nature of eBirding though, of course. Because, if you're wandering around and you miss that chestnut-sided warbler, Merlin says, it's a chestnut-sided warbler singing, As soon as you kind of go, okay, yep, I'll accept that. It's changed how we're bird watching because we're detecting it with the machine before we're detecting it with our own eyes. That's the first thing people want. More acoustic stuff, more automatic stuff coming in. Better information on IDs. They want to be able to put a proper field guide into an app, not just photographs and so on. More information on hotspots. So if you're going down to East Lake Park to see that harlequin, they want to be able to go, okay, where has everybody worked? Where has everybody walked? Where exactly do I park? So they want it so that they can really visit that easily and know about it. And often they want live information, like kind of a rare bird alert for birds that are arrived that comes straight in. So far, we've been very delicate about doing that. But clearly, if we wanted to, we could, you could say immediately, even onto a device like a watch, there's a harlequin down in the lake, drop the computer keyboard, get in the car, drive to the lake, see it, and so on. You could provide that information at the moment. The interesting thing to me is does this improve what we're doing? Or does this sort of break that link between, no, I want to discover things myself? The next set of things, I'm doing this in increasingly irritating order, obviously. Actually, the last one's okay. The next one is to be able to share observations with friends more easily. Not with the entire world, but if you kind of had a fun morning. So yesterday I kind of came home in the car, the local turkey brigade were all over the lawn sort of thing. I kind of want to send it to my kids and say 12 turkeys on the driveway on the way home. Yes, it's really kind of cool to see, particularly if you're British. So you want to share those sorts of observations with people. Something relevant for the dinner that we were having earlier, also being able to build community groups more effectively. How do you support clubs like this to build groups, to do winter counts and things like that? And of course, potentially to have community challenges where you ask people to do particular activities rather than just bird watching, where everybody wants to go. Say, let's try and do, a particular type of forest or a particular reserve or something like that. And then lastly, usually people are asking for links to other types of information, like the Cayuga Bird Club site, for example. We know that somebody's come to this area, they're bird watching all around it. They've been to all the sites. We know this would probably be the moment to say, if you're interested in birds, try this website. You could push that information to people. That's what people do when they're trying to sell you things. You know that. Now, typically, we're not trying to sell somebody something, although we're always trying to get membership, aren't we? But typically, we're not trying to sell people. We're trying to activate people. We're trying to say, join the club. Think about the land trust, the local land trust or something like that. Do people want that? Or is that going to be, oh my God, I've already signed up to all these things that are pushing information at me. Birds are my escape from that. So this is what I suspect is coming for us to make decisions about how do we want our birding community to be. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I know we're on 9 o'clock. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for having me.